In the new book, you do talk about protein and how Americans are having too much of that. Bring that in.
The protein is a tricky one because it's sort of good and bad, right? So protein is good in that it is not carbohydrate. So if your problem is that you're worried about stimulating insulin too much, then yes, it's not a carbohydrate, so it's a good thing. It stimulates a lot of GLP-1, so therefore creates a lot of satiety. So it can be a good thing. High protein diets can be a good thing. On the other hand, so proteins are amino acids. So amino acids, are used to build muscle, but you can't store them. There's a limited storage facility. So, if you eat carbs, which is glucose, you can store glucose. If you eat fat, you can store fat, which is triglycerides. You can't really store amino acids. So any excess protein that you eat has to be turned into glucose, right? So if you're not eating enough protein, then you need more protein. But once you get enough protein, if you eat more protein, that protein gets turned into glucose. So the question is, how much in an average person, how much is going to get turned into glucose? And the answer is somewhere around 70% of the protein that is eaten currently is getting turned into glucose. So therefore, it'd be hard to say, well, eat a lot more protein because, a lot of that is just going to be turned into glucose. So you're not actually getting more protein, you're actually getting more glucose because the body has to turn it into glucose. The tricky part is how much is enough, right? And this is where there's a huge debate. And recently with the dietary guidelines, it actually went up. So the old recommended daily allowance was 0.8 grams per kilogram per day. And that's gone up now to 1.2 to 1.6. If you look at how much Americans eat, it's roughly around 1.2. So it's fine. On the other hand, if you're eating more glucose, then sure, it can certainly control your appetite, right? Controlling the hunger is more important than controlling the calories, and therefore can be a very useful adjunct. So, I think that the level of protein that people are eating now is probably fine. I don't think you need to go high protein. And that's where the dietary guidelines are. So they've set it at a range now where it's pretty close to what average Americans are doing, except for probably like vegans or something like that. Vegans have a tougher time because proteins are, in a lot of animal foods, and therefore that's the problem. Just a quick thing about vegans and vegetarians. People always ask me about, how about being vegan? It's like, there's nothing intrinsically good about being a vegetable food. We're omnivores, so we can eat animal foods, we can eat vegetable foods. If you want to eat vegetable foods because of environmental or ethical reasons, that's one thing. From a purely nutritional standpoint, there's nothing intrinsically good about being from a plant because you could eat chocolate donuts and pizza all day long, and that's not good for you. You can get vegetarian cheese, you can get, it's highly processed. You can eat French fries, like stuff that's potato chips, just not good for you in any way. Everybody knows it, but yet it's fully vegan. If you just ate French fries and chocolate donuts all day, you'd be vegan and you'd be so unhealthy, right? I don't think there's any debate about that. So the point is that you can eat, good natural food and you can eat, bad foods, which are ultra processed. But being a vegetable or being not a vegetable it's a totally independent. It plays no role in determining whether this is a good food or a bad food, right? Generally, ultra processed is bad and natural is good. So if you're eating beans and salad all day long and vegetables, yeah, great. But if you're eating French fries and chocolate donuts, not great, right? So this whole vegetarian debate to me is not, it's a separate issue, but they do get a lot less protein than normal. And what you find is that they actually are at risk of a lot of, lower muscle mass, lower bone mass. They actually are very high risk of that. Again, that's been fairly well established because they're not getting nearly the same amount of protein as somebody who sort of eats everything. Because when you eat that steak, you're just getting a lot of protein.
And tying this to our thesis today, lowering the insulin on a diet like that, plant-based, vegan, vegetarian, a lot of times carbohydrates are naturally going to be a lot higher.
Yeah, the problem is intrinsic to the food actually, because the reason that vegetarians eat lots of carbohydrates is that's the way that plants store energy. So if you think about a plant, it gets energy from the sun. It stores it as carbohydrates. That's, whether it's wheat or potatoes or rice, it stores that energy as carbohydrate. Animals don't do that. So cows don't store energy mainly in the form of glucose. They store it mainly in the form of fat. So when you're eating animal foods, you're eating mostly proteins and fats. When you're eating plant foods, you're eating mostly glucose because that's just the way they are. Plants store energy as glucose, animals store, energy as fat, right? So animal foods, like what are some super high carb animal foods, right? It's hard to think of them, like the steaks and the chicken and the fish and the milk and the cheese. And is it high in carbs? Like none of that really. You can have certain vegetables that are higher in fat, so coconut and avocado and stuff, but a lot of them, like rice and potatoes and wheat, are high in carbs. So when you have nations like India, where they're largely vegetarian for religious purposes, you wind up with a lot of diabetes. But that's just the nature of the foods they're eating. They're eating a lot of glucose. That's because they're vegetarian, right? So I'm not pro or con. Like if you want to be vegetarian for ethical reasons, then do so. I don't care. I'm more interested in the science of the whole thing.
Are you pro or con when it comes to the other end of the spectrum, an all meat diet?
Again, I think it can be a very healthy diet, actually. I don't think that there's any problem with eating mostly meat. I don't think it's actually the easiest diet to follow. Like, you know, I enjoy a lot of vegetable foods, right? I love eggplant, for example. It's like, would I want to cut it out? No. Do I have to cut it out? No. So it's like, why would I want to? Right. So I think if you want to eat a carnivore diet, I have no problem with that because again, we're omnivores and you can be very healthy. Like people used to think, no, you can't because of this or that reason. Turns out that, hey, a lot of people do it and actually do very well with it. In fact, some people claim it's a lot healthier for you. And again, it could be. Like, I think we're all individuals, so not one specific diet is the right for all of us. Just like some of us are allergic to this or that, right? And they can't tolerate it, but doesn't mean I can't tolerate it, right? It's just a different problem entirely.
Again, coming back to our insulin, if somebody wanted to bring that down in the greatest way, an all meat diet would get us there quickest.
It would probably be one of the quicker ways to do it. It tends to have a few disadvantages, mostly long term, because you're drastically restricting the number of the variety of foods that you eat. So compliance, I think, is a bit of an issue. So if you want to do it for a short period of time, it's probably fine, right? Same with a lot of vegetables. Like I really like cauliflower. I really like tomatoes, for example. So it's like to have to cut them out. It's difficult, right? And it makes it the variety of what you can do, because you could, use beef with broccoli or something like that, right? And it's a whole new dish compared to just beef by itself, right? So it does tend to be a bit monotonous, which is actually pretty good for weight loss, because in a monotonous diet, you take away a lot of the hedonic hunger, right? If you're eating the same thing over and over and over again, at some point you're just going to not eat very much because it gives you no pleasure. So even if you're to eat, you can take any food, and this is the lesson from the Kempner rice diet. So this was in the 20s. People said you could eat white rice and white sugar as much as you wanted, and people did pretty well. But if you think about it, how many days would you eat white rice and white sugar? That's all you ate, by the way, before you start to say, no, thank you, until you're like, you would get so sick of white rice and sugar that the minute you are not hungry, like the very sort of millisecond that you've had enough, you'd be like, no, because your hedonic hunger is like zero. It's just not appealing to you, right? And it happens with every single diet, right? If you if you bring down the choices to like 0 or 1, then you really can lose weight on anything. It's just because, we are naturally, inclined to have a variety of foods and a variety of flavors. We all like it. It gives us pleasure to eat different foods, right? That's why eating is one of life's greatest pleasures. And that's why you have to acknowledge that there's this whole other side to eating. And if you mix them up, you say, "Hey, it's the carbs." It's like, no, 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 it's not the carbs. You're not even talking about the right thing anymore. If all you're eating is white rice and sugar, then yes, you're not getting a lot of carbs, but you've really cut down all your other, pleasure of eating to 0 or even negative. Like, you might be disgusted by what you're eating, right? So you're not going to eat because the pleasure side of the equation is so low.
How long were they on that Kempner diet? Because I'd
Um,
have to imagine pretty quickly they would have nutrient deficiencies versus an all
yeah.
meat diet, even sticking with just beef. The nutrient density there is just so high in comparison.
I'd have to look at it. It was in the 20s and 30s. They had these studies on the Kempner rice diet. Somebody always brings it up, and I'm always like, if you think it's so good, you use it on your patients, right? It's like, go ahead, be my guest, right? They'll get better. They just won't stick to it. Not if they have a choice, right? So I think it was like weeks and weeks of this diet. It's like, I think I'd be sick of white rice and sugar in like a day and a half, right? I don't like white rice and sugar that much.
Since you made it to the end of this clip, I know you're going to love the full episode. Click here to watch. I'll see you over there.
Different foods stimulate different levels of insulin. What's insulin's job? Well, to tell you to store more body fat. If it's chronically high, you're going to gain a lot of weight because you're moving a lot of glucose into the cells. They're going to fill up so that glucose